Good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning.
Hey, we're down to the stretch run, right? One more week to go. Well, then exams. How many of you taking summer classes? What for punishment? I'm teaching the summer class, so I can't complain. I sent the announcement out yesterday, a little Easter egg for you, with all the information on the exam. Did everybody get it? All righty. Any questions? Concerns, fears? All righty. On Friday, I was talking about Johnson's decision to send in ground troops. And remember, initially it was supposed to be, quote, defensive, the so-called enclave strategy. But that didn't last too long. In fact, by the end of the year, by the end of 1965, there'll be 184,000 Americans in Vietnam. Remember, we had about 18,000 advisors before that. By the end of the year, it's going to be 184,000. By the end of 1968, it'll be over 543,000. So this is a period of rapid escalation and where the Americans basically take over the war. Up till now, we've been trying to help the South Vietnamese. But that didn't seem to be working. Their government was in disarray. Their army was a failure. So in many ways, we're going to Americanize the war. We're going to take the lead in it. Now, ironically, at roughly the same time that we're deciding to enter the war big time, so are the North Vietnamese. Up to this point, the war had largely been between the South Vietnamese, ARVN, versus the Viet Cong. And remember, these guys were guerrillas from the South. They were natives, most of them anyway, to South Vietnam. Well, now the United States is entering the war. And at the same time, the North Vietnamese make roughly the same decision. They decided to send their army in. And it's usually known as the NVA to the Americans, the North Vietnamese Army. Officially, it was known as PAVN, People's Army of Vietnam. But we always call it the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army. So the very nature of the war is going to undergo a massive change in 1965. It's going to go from being largely between the South Vietnamese and the Viet Cong to being between the Americans and the North Vietnamese. This is the guy that's going to be in charge of the American effort, General William Westmoreland. He's head of MACV, Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. Westmoreland is a highly decorated World War II and Korean War veteran. But he's used to fighting conventional wars. Vietnam's not necessarily a conventional war. In fact, up till now, it's largely been an insurgency, a guerrilla war. Good morning. Talking about Vietnam. Holding territory doesn't mean squat in Vietnam. There are really few strategic targets to take. So Westmoreland is going to decide on a strategy known as attrition. What do I mean by attrition? What does it sound like? You're fighting a war of attrition. What kind of war is that?
Yeah.
Please?
Yeah.
Of course, yeah.
They scorch their, burn their woods, drown their crops, starve them out.
That's pretty much total war. That's a little different. Attrition basically involves killing so many of the enemy they give up. That's attrition warfare. World War I's a classic case of that. Basically, you bleed the other side dry. You make it so expensive in human lives that they can't continue the war. Now, one, that's Western misunderstanding of the Vietnamese. They've been fighting invaders for thousands of years, whether it was the Chinese, the Cambodians, the French, or the Americans. They're not going to give up. Now, this so-called attrition strategy gets its first big test in the fall of 1965. In a rather isolated South Vietnamese valley called Ai Drang. For the first time, American and North Vietnamese forces in large numbers are going to fight each other. We had located a bunch of NVA in the Ai Drang Valley and decided to surprise them using airborne helicopter troops. And what developed was one of the largest battles of the Vietnam War, the Battle of the Ai Drang Valley. The Ai Drang covered this area here, basically. It was a long valley, long, narrow valley that separated Vietnam from Cambodia. And by the way, here's a picture of it. Give you an idea what it looks like. And here's American air cavalry during the battle. And something else I want to point out. Notice how these guys are getting off the chopper. Notice it's not on the ground. They learned early on it wasn't a good idea to land. They were far more vulnerable. So the helicopters learned to get about 3 or 4 feet off the ground, over, and then you jump down. Then they could take off real quick. So that's a typical way you would exit a helicopter during the Vietnam War. Combat exiting. By the time it's all over in November, the United States had won a huge victory. Over 300 Americans had been killed, 305 to be exact, and hundreds wounded. You guys ever see an old Mel Gibson movie called We Were Soldiers? You ever see that? That's about Ai Drang. About landing Zone X. All that. Please? Well, it's largely about the experience of Colonel Ray Moore's battalion. Yeah, that was Mel Gibson.
I got it.
Yeah. But anyway, I'm just telling you, there's kind of like a movie out about this. Didn't mean to get sidetracked. Over 305 Americans are killed, but by our estimates, over 3,500 North Vietnamese. And both sides learned lessons from this. We learned the wrong one, they learned the right one. The North Vietnamese learned wasn't a good idea to stand up to us. If we could find them and fix them, keep them in a certain place, we could annihilate them. American firepower was awesome. So they learned to avoid us. Only fight when they had the advantage or if they had no choice. So they're going to be a rather elusive enemy after this. We learned the wrong lesson. It convinced Westmoreland and the other senior military officials that attrition was a workable strategy. Now, if your strategy is based on killing as many of the enemy as possible, how do you gauge success? How do you know if you're winning?
I didn't start death count.
Yeah, body count.
And then start counting every dead person around.
Yeah. They rely on several factors, but the main one is the so-called body counts. How many enemy are reported dead by your units in the field? And there's a lot of problems with that. One is simple human error. Firefights are very confusing things. They're a lot more orderly on TV and the movies. But you really don't know what the hell is going on. It's kind of hard to tell if you killed somebody or wounded them. Both sides had a tendency to try and rescue their dead. You didn't want to leave your dead behind. So in an intense firefight, you're not sure how many you killed. Secondly, given the type of firepower we had, how do you count bodies you've blown to bits? Seriously. I knew one Vietnam veteran used to, when they ran convoys up the main roads, they'd take flatbed trucks and put 2 twin .50 calibers on them. You ever see a 50 caliber shell? Yeah, about that big. You know what's going to happen to a human being if you hit them with one of those things? Yeah, it's going to be like stepping on a bug. They were taking fire from a tree line, and they were told to open up, and they basically, it's triple canopy jungle over there, they basically were cutting the tops off of all the trees. You can see the trees explode from the firepower. And when they went up there later to do a body count, there was an arm over here, a head over there, it was probably a torso over here. What are you going to do? Are you going to piece them all back together again? Like a giant gruesome puzzle? Well, that might have worked, counting heads. They decided they wanted 3 days R&R, so they just counted every body part. That's another problem with the body counts. The senior officials were so intense, so serious about getting high body counts, there was a lot of pressure to perform. And a lot of commanders would give their units extra leave, extra benefits if they brought in a high body count that month. So do you want to spend 3 months out, or excuse me, 3 days out on a lonely fire base fighting giant mosquitoes in Viet Cong? Or do you want to spend 3 days in Bangkok or Hong Kong? It's not much of a choice, is it? So the body counts tended to be extremely inaccurate. Gave us the false impression that we were winning the war early on. Now, as the war escalates in Vietnam, it begins to escalate here at home as well. From the beginning, a lot of people were opposed to it. The war was morally ambiguous at best. We weren't supporting an open democratic government. We were supporting basically a brutal dictatorship. So from the very beginning, there was some resistance to it. Those that favored the war were nicknamed hawks, and those that opposed it were nicknamed doves. And much like today, celebrities took sides. John Lennon, remember him from the Beatles? Joan Baez, Neil Young, Jane Fonda, Martin Luther King Jr., and some celebrities supported the war. John Wayne was an avid hawk, even made a movie about Vietnam in 1968 to promote his views. It was called The Green Berets. And by the way, it's kind of humorous at times. He didn't actually film it in Vietnam. He filmed it in Georgia. Aside from the fact that the topography is totally different, there's another problem. There's a scene in the movie that shows the sun going down over the Gulf of Tonkin. It's on the other side of the world. It would be coming up over the Gulf of Tonkin. That's what you get for filming the movie in Georgia. By the way, John Wayne never spent a single day in the military. Took a draft deferment during World War II. But John Wayne, Bob Hope, Jimmy Stewart, they were all pro-war. And the division among celebrities isn't all that important, but it mirrors the division in the nation at large. And probably here's the most infamous anti-war demonstrator from the war. Where did she go? Okay, where did she go? Hang on a second, folks. Anyway, I'm trying to find Jane Fonda for you. I can't find much. Here we go. Okay. 1971, for example, Jane Fonda actually went to North Vietnam and was photographed sitting on an NVA anti-aircraft battery. And by the way, most of what you heard about her trip is wrong. She did not call the prisoners baby killers. She did not turn them in for giving her mail to bring home. In fact, she was actually very kind to them brought mail home to the families, the first time in months they could send anything home. But on the other hand, she was naive and stupid. I mean, being photographed on an anti-aircraft battery, for God's sake, that's shooting down American aircraft.
That's the end.
Yeah. She later said she was tricked, and she was kind of naive, but still, one should know better than that. No. And we didn't declare war. She had every legal right to go over there. It was in poor taste, without a doubt, but no, she wasn't a traitor. I'll tell you what, though, most Vietnam veterans I know, they've forgiven Johnson, they've forgiven Nixon, they've forgiven the enemy, but they won't forgive Jane Fonda. I knew a guy had a Navy veteran. Every time you get a new truck, you get a new bumper sticker for it. And it always said, Vietnam veterans are not fond of Jane. You think she started the damn war? Now, there have been an anti-war movement since the first American ground troops went in. Back in April 1965, there was the first mass demonstration in Washington. In August of '66, there were massive demonstrations throughout the United States, including Cleveland, Denver, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and other cities. And here's an anti-war protest in Washington, D.C. And I use that kind of way to point out that that's a stereotype. Of course, you can't see it because of the light. Like this. Notice it's all young hippie types. That's a stereotype and a false impression of the anti-war movement. Young people were definitely involved. I mean, look who's fighting that war, right? Who's got the greatest staking going over there. But the anti-war movement actually represented a cross-section of the American public. A lot of women were involved in the movement. Civil rights activists are involved in the movement. Traditional religious organizations are involved. In fact, some of the first anti-war demonstrators happen to be traditional pacifists, such as Quakers and people like that. But the number and intensity, here's one in May of 1967, and this one is largely led by the Civil Rights Coalition. And it's hard to tell, it's easier to see it online, but this is Coretta Scott King right here. Dr. King's wife. Dr. King had been muting his criticism of the war. Johnson had done a lot for the civil rights movement, and the movement was grateful and was hesitant about questioning or criticizing Johnson about the war. But finally, in the spring of '67, not only Coretta Scott King, but Dr. King, in a very famous speech in Riverside Church in New York, came out against the war. And that did lead to a break between Dr. King and Johnson. One of the things Johnson praised above almost anything else was loyalty. And he figured if he did something for you, you better support him. So even though Dr. King was acting on his conscience, Lyndon Johnson never forgave him for it. In October of '67, 50,000 protesters demonstrated in Washington, D.C. And by that point, some of the more famous chants had been developed that you would hear in a lot of the protests, including "Hell no, we won't go." "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" And the ever popular 1, 2, 3, 4, we don't want your fucking war. So get a chant going here. That'd freak everybody else out, wouldn't it? Hear this whole class chanting that. Hey, wonder what the hell I'm up to today. And to show you how deeply the war is affecting American society, and to tie it into a movie I know a lot of you folks want to see next week, debuts. The Vietnam War even invaded comic books. I'm sure some of you folks are more than familiar with Iron Man. That was before Robert Downey Jr. was playing him, but still. But it even made the cover of Marvel Comics. Here he is at an anti-war demonstration. How many of you folks plan to see the Avengers Endgame? Yeah. I grew up with that stuff. I had this.
Who came first? Iron Man, or is there any relation to this song by Ozzy Osbourne?
Oh, yeah, Black Sabbath song. Oh, he was around before the song. But the song doesn't have anything to do with him. Because they're English and they'd never heard of him at that point.
Hey, you can tell by this.
Now, one of the things that people hated about the war and were protesting was the inequities in the draft. Technically, everybody had the same chance of being drafted. But the military, especially when there wasn't a war going on, didn't need everybody. So they created a series of deferments in the 1950s. They called it manpower channeling. They didn't want to disrupt college or industries. So if you were in college, you had a deferment. If you had a skilled occupation, you had a deferment. If you were married and had kids, you had a deferment. Plus, you could get a variety of medical deferments. Lots of different ailments would keep you out of the draft. There were a lot of inequities. The wealthier you were, the less chance you had to go into the military. You could shop around for a doctor that would find something wrong with you. Oh, let's see, let's say maybe bone spurs. Now, I can't think of many other wars that would have kept you out of, but I can think of one individual that got a deferment because of that. The rich could buy their way out of the war, the poor didn't have any choice. If you're white working class, African American, or Latino, guess what? You're probably going to go to war. At the height of the war, a white male had about a 1 out of 4 chance of getting drafted. That meant out of you 4 guys over there, only one of you guys would have to go. I'll let you cut cards to decide, okay?
Whoa.
Well, all of a sudden it's down to you 2 guys. If you're African American or Latino, you got a 1 out of 3 chance of going. Now, obviously, a lot of people attempted to avoid the draft. Some for good reasons, some simply because they didn't feel like serving. During the war, over 500,000 young men refused induction, avoided the draft. Only about half of them were ever prosecuted by the US government, and only about 10% of them were actually found guilty. Again, if you're white, middle, and upper class, there are plenty of ways to buy your way out of that as well. Get a good lawyer, for example. There were lawyers that specialized in beating the draft. They can pretty much guarantee you that they could keep you out for the right price. Like I said, college was a safe haven. And again, that didn't matter if you were, white, Latino, black. It didn't matter. If you were in college, you had a deferment. But keep in mind, you didn't have all the Pell Grants and stuff like that. Student loans weren't as easy to get. So the vast majority of working class whites and minorities can't afford college. During the Vietnam War, only about 5% of the draft eligible African American males were in college. So there's a lot of inequities in the draft on who has to go and fight and who doesn't. Probably the most famous draft invader in the war was a famous heavyweight boxer. Some of us consider him, if we follow boxing, to be the greatest heavyweight ever. Muhammad Ali. And just to erase any doubts, that's Muhammad Ali, that's Sonny Liston. Ali had been born Cassius Clay in Louisville, Kentucky. He was actually named after a famous abolitionist. He won the light heavyweight medal in Rome in the 1960 Olympics, went pro and was unbeaten. But he was also cocky and brash. Now, he had originally failed the intelligence test for the Army. But as the war heated up, the Army lowered its draft requirements, suddenly making Ali eligible. During that time, he had converted to the Nation of Islam. He'd become a, quote, black Muslim, and changed his name to Muhammad Ali. The Nation of Islam has a long tradition of not fighting in wars. But the US government doesn't recognize them as a pacifistic denomination. And kind of for good reason. They only object to fighting certain wars. If it's a holy war, a jihad, they will fight. And if you want to be a conscientious objector, by the way, you can't be selective. You can't say, well, I'll fight this war, but not that one. It has to be all or nothing. By the way, Ali was sincere in his beliefs. Don't have any doubt about that. He's charged with draft evasion. And I want to point out, as a rich celebrity, he could have bought his way out. His manager was a colonel in the Illinois National Guard. They offered Ali a billet, an enlistment in the Guard. He wouldn't have had to do anything. And that would have given him a deferment from going to Vietnam. Instead of taking the easy road out, he lived up to his principles. He'll be stripped of his heavyweight title, not allowed to box. By the way, here he is being arrested for draft evasion. And few people realize in the years he wasn't allowed to box, he actually became the fifth Beatle. Actually, they were in Miami, and they dropped in to visit him, and he went to the studio with them. Luckily, he never was on any of their albums. If you ever heard him sing, you'd know why. Eventually, Ali will have his case dismissed by the Supreme Court on a technicality, largely because they wanted to avoid the controversy. Other members of the Nation of Islam aren't going to be as lucky. During the Vietnam War, over 100 members of the black Muslims will end up doing jail time for their beliefs. So again, I want to point out that if you have money and influence, you can beat the rack. If you don't, unfortunately, end up in jail. Now, the draft will undergo a lot of changes later in the war. Graduate deferments end in 1968, so being in graduate school doesn't get you out of the war anymore. But if you're in school, your grandfather. So you really don't have to worry about it for about 3 years. Undergraduate deferments are phased out, and in 1969, they institute a lottery system. It's based on your birthday. They pick 365 days. And if your birthday's the first one they pick, guess what? You might as well pack your bags for Vietnam. If you're like number 350, you can relax. You're not going anywhere. By that point, the war's going to be winding down. Now, during this time, McVie and Westmoreland are recording a lot of American progress. They claim they're winning the war. But by 1967, Johnson wants results. 68's an election year. And he's thinking about running for re-election. So he sends his defense secretary, Robert McNamara, calls Westmoreland home from Vietnam, and sends them both out on a public relations tour, basically to promote American success in Vietnam. And McNamara, on this tour, will use a phrase that will come back to haunt him. Basically said that we are on the road to ultimate victory. We see the light at the end of the tunnel. And that light turned out to be an oncoming train. For all their pronouncements of victory, that's going to get rather brutally shattered in February of 1968. Now, in the late fall and winter of 67, 68, an American fire base in northern South Vietnam, known as Khe Sanh, came under siege. Okay. Khe Sanh is roughly 6 miles east of the Laotian border and about 15 or 14 miles south of the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. And by the end of 1967, it was surrounded by over 50,000 North Vietnamese troops. Now, do you remember when I talked about the Franco-Vietnam War, the battle that lost the war for them, Dien Bien Phu, an isolated base that was surrounded and sieged by the enemy? It was beginning to look like Khe Sanh was going to be another Dien Bien Phu. For a lot of reasons it wouldn't, but they didn't realize that at the time. Johnson begins to become obsessed with Khe Sanh. So instead of evacuating it, we reinforced it. Westmoreland thought this would be a good chance to pull the enemy towards us and destroy him. Johnson becomes so obsessed with it, he has a sand model of the base built in the Situation Room in the White House. And his aides could find him 2, 3 o'clock in the morning in this ratty bathrobe down there staring at the sand model. In fact, he snapped at the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff one time, Earl Wheeler, when he say it might be difficult to hold Khe Sanh. He remarked, "I don't need another goddamn Dien Bien Phu." That's about my best Johnson. Sorry. You couldn't, huh?
Sorry.
Where's everybody going?
I'm going to the dentist. I don't know where to go. Is that right? Right.
Well, stay crabby. That's a good look at the dentist. Talking about attrition today, I'm slowly losing you guys. Now, Khe Sanh was never going to be another Dien Bien Phu or Dien Bien Phu if you're Lyndon Johnson. The whole purpose of the attacks there, and some in the Central Highlands and other places, was to draw the Americans and South Vietnamese away from their real target. Now, the biggest holiday in all of Southeast Asia is Tet. That's the Lunar New Year. Being Westerners, we tend to go on a solar year, but in a lot of Southeast Asia, they still mark time based on a lunar New Year. And that always occurs in late February. Traditionally, there had been a truce during Tet. I mean, both sides, both the North and South Vietnamese, Viet Cong, they're all Vietnamese. They all celebrate the same holidays. During World War I, the first year of World War I, there was actually an unofficial Christmas truce between both sides. So we weren't expecting a lot of trouble. First day of Tet, all hell breaks loose throughout Vietnam. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong attack every major city, every provincial capital, every major American and armed installation. It's nationwide. Now, despite the surprise, and despite the fact over half of Harbin was out on leave, The Americans and ARMN both respond quickly and effectively. And much of the Viet Cong are destroyed. Now, it's going to take several weeks. The biggest battle is over the old imperial capital, Hue. And again, because of the way Vietnamese is pronounced, this is how it's spelled. It's pronounced like W-A-Y. Several hundred Americans will be killed. Much of the city will be leveled. But eventually we take the city back. And what we discover was one of the larger mass atrocities in the war. Find a couple of mass graves. Together, they contain at least 5,000 individuals. When the Viet Cong had taken over the city, they'd gone on a rampage to eliminate anybody that could either contest their rule or people they had personal vendettas with. Political leaders, teachers, Buddhist leaders, anybody that could oppose their regime had been murdered. Now, the battlefield, Tet, turned out to be a huge American and South Vietnamese success. In fact, the Viet Cong had been decimated. It's going to be up to the North Vietnamese to really carry the burden of the war from here on in. But psychologically and politically, Tet was a huge defeat for us. Based on what Johnson was saying, light at the end of the tunnel and all that, this should have never happened. According to American body counts, they shouldn't have had enough guys left to launch this attack. So ultimately, the biggest political casualty turned out to be Lyndon Johnson. This is one of the more famous photographs from the war. South Vietnamese General Nguyen Ngoc Mun executing a Viet Cong prisoner. It was part of there was reporters filming it, and he was walking down the street and then just pulled out his pistol and blew his brains out. And on one hand, it looked horrible on American television. This is our ally doing that. But if you knew the backstory, it's a little more explainable. The Viet Cong guerrilla had just been part of a group that had massacred everybody at the main Saigon radio and TV station. Innocent civilians. That was a very nasty war, and both sides committed horrible atrocities. And here are American Marines securing part of the way during the Tet Offensive. You can still see some of the battle damage today if you go to Hue. So Tet revealed that contrary to the pronouncements the Johnson administration was making, we weren't winning the war. By late '67, Johnson's approval rating had dropped to just 48%. By March, it was down to 36%. On the 31st of March, Johnson gave a nationally televised TV address. And instead of starting the speech the way his speechwriters wrote it, I'm here to talk to you tonight about the war in Vietnam. Johnson started the speech by saying, I'm here to talk to you about peace in Vietnam. He said he was going to halt the bombing attack on North Vietnam, Rolling Thunder, and would open up peace negotiations with North Vietnam. Try and find a peaceful end to the war. He then further shocked the nation by announcing he would not seek re-election in 1968. We knew in March of 1968 that we weren't going to win the war. Before it finally ends, in January of '73, it'll cost another 14,000 American lives. Now, that's just the beginning of what turns out to be a very bloody year in American history, including 2 high-profile assassinations. And we'll look at that on Wednesday. Have a good day, ladies and gentlemen. Try and enjoy this nice weather.